Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. I'm Meredith Zonsius, Communications Manager at Strategic Treasure, and today's host. Our featured speaker is Craig Jeffery, our Managing Partner and Founder. Today, we're excited to talk about 2019 Year in Review. As we approach the end of the year, we're going to take a look back so we can take a look forward. We'll cover what has Treasury been working on, thinking about, and acting on this past year. And how can that influence our thinking and plans as we look to the year ahead in 2020? Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm looking forward to discussing the prior year and maybe even some things about 2020.
Fantastic. Let's begin with economics. Any thoughts on the economic environment this past year?
I think the first thing is that you should ask an economist about that, not a consultant and researcher, but there is some information just to share fairly quickly. I think a key element that comes up is that the tailwinds that have been pushing the economy forward, and certainly in North America and other parts of the world, have decreased a bit. They're not pushing as strongly. There are some crosswinds as well. Crosswinds, namely trade and IP disputes that exist, most notably U.S. and China. But there's some issues there. So some parts of the world aren't as strong as others. But it still is positive, particularly in North America, where we're headquartered. A couple thoughts on that. Unemployment and employment numbers are very good, particularly in the U.S. And some other countries. This is not seen a result of very high labor rates going up, and so there's certainly some spend there. Secondly, we see capital being deployed. Organizations are putting money into efficiency initiatives, putting in tech to help make their organization more scalable, more efficient, and growing forward. That's quite good. Plans to spend, that sentiment there continues to be elevated, not as high as before, not as positive before, but we would still say there's tailwinds, not just headwinds. Central bank actions have started to show in the past year a little bit more of a negative outlook, particularly Bank of Japan and the European Central Bank. They're taking, and some of the Fed is taking a wait and see approach. They're ready to act. They're making some motions and indicating some readiness to make changes if they're softening or as they're softening. I'm really looking forward to our next soon-to-be-released Treasury Perspective Survey, where we gauge the sentiment across many of these different domains, and we have multiple years to compare that. I think that's going to be very interesting. I suspect it'll show a little bit of decline in optimism, but still trend on the positive side, and stay clear of pessimism. But that'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Okay, perfect. So words in 2019, what are some buzzwords used this past year, and will that change in 2020?
Yeah, the year of whatever is often times said. So there's a couple words that are useful and that increase in usage over a period of time, not defined by a border of a year, but just a couple words as a quick way of touching on them. One is big data, data lakes. We're all familiar with historical terms like data warehouse, but data lakes really came into vogue. And big data is this concept of structured and unstructured data. When you think of structured data, it's I guess I'll just describe it really briefly as that it might be in a table or a matrix or a database format, whereas unstructured data might be sitting on a range of websites or embedded in text across the board. And so how do we harness and organize that? Because there's so much more data being created across every domain, from different, the Internet of Things, data is being captured, and how do we manage that and use that? So that's a big issue. And so data lakes are a way of how do we harness all of this data? We don't necessarily put it in pure data warehouses, but we have these large stores of data lakes where we can then access it and do that. So that's one. Or big data lakes would be two of the terms in the same vein. The second one would be business intelligence, or BI, or dashboarding. People have really taken off this ability to use this ability of some of the technology to run their own analysis. It's more self-service. It's putting more analysis in the hands of the end user rather than just in the hands of the person in IT or the data scientist. And so they can ask and discover what goes on in the organization more rapidly. So BI tools, BI, the BI stack, all those items are becoming more common. And it really is an outgrowth of the growth of data and the ability to use this technology to do faster analysis. And there's obviously some technology pieces of that makes it much easier to use. Just being able to store more data in memory so the responses are instantaneous. Another word is RPA for robotic process automation. We've done some podcasts on this. This is the ability to help make connections from one system to another. In Treasury, it's interesting because the leading companies are exploring this and allowing to make those connections that aren't pure system to system. It's a bridge between those two. So it gets us part of the way towards straight-through processing. APIs or application programming interfaces they've been around a lot longer. People are talking about APIs much more, largely because banks are talking about them, because banks have been pushed to do them, particularly in Europe with some of the regulations on that. And so the use of the ability of a system to connect to another system through a fast protocol like API, as opposed to preparing a file and sending it, is getting much more attention in the Treasury space. And that's much closer to straight-through processing, or it provides opportunities for better straight-through processing. And you can see some growth in API services, like some of the web services utilities growing and expanding to some broader API, open API that's easier to connect without necessarily a proprietary web services interface. So it's the growth of API. And finally, I want to talk about a word that you hear a lot. You hear holistic a lot. Mm-hmm. This is nothing specific with Treasury, but you hear a holistic look. And this is something we used to always refer to as comprehensive. Mm-hmm. How do we look at comprehensive? And so that's just another term. It seems like it's come up a lot the last year and a half when we're looking at how do we look at the end-to-end state of things. Mm-hmm. So end-to-end and holistic or comprehensive are other terms that people are thinking about. And I think that's a good process view that they have.
That's a good explanation. Let's continue with some other topics. GDPR and LIBOR. What has been the impact of these changes?
So GDPR has been around for a little while now. And if you're in Treasury, you might say, why do I care about this? If you're a bank or a technology firm or one of the media areas, you care about it because how can you stay in contact with people? You have to continue to provide information that makes sense. GDPR, the right to be forgotten, the right to block things out, has really reduced distribution lists very significantly. And this is impact technology vendors' ability to market. And I think that is driving those organizations to put out a lot more content, because people will come for content. They don't want just marketing. And this is really forcing their hand to deliver a lot of good content that companies and people will want in order to give up their name, their email address to get that information. And so that's been very interesting and important. We've seen that impact as well. That's helped. We've always delivered a ton of content through different channels, from analyst reports to surveys, information that people want that's educational, it's not marketing. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we've had a good run up. People continue to drive and pull information. And while we've been seeing very, very, very strong growth in Europe in our distribution list, we would say it has not grown quite as fast as before because of some of the GDPR regulations and complying with them. But still, we see that area to grow on an outside port and an outside basis, largely due to if you give good content, people will come. But that's having an impact on companies and how they market. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned LIBOR, and we have some podcasts on LIBOR. People have heard about LIBOR for a while. That's the replacement process is coming up. You have to have a replacement, by the end of, in a fairly short time, by the end of 2021, it'll disappear. And this is a interesting mid-sized topic, I think, for people to think about. Organizations have their debt that might be tied to a basis like LIBOR. So how do you handle that with your technology system? If you're doing hedging, you have debt that's in there. What are the replacement models that exist? So making sure your technology handles it. It's also driving people to review their debt and making sure that it complies with that and seeing what changes are needed. Finally, I think as we've looked at some of the newer replacements of of LIBOR, you see a fair amount of volatility because the liquidity against some of these newer and maybe some of the existing replacements, if you will, are not as funded as well. And so you can see some significant spikes. So over time, that should decrease, the volatility of those should decrease. And I think as we get towards the end of the runway for LIBOR, that's going to have a lot more volatility because people will be exiting out. So I think there's going to be a pretty big run before the end of it. So just a couple interesting things on those two topics.
Interesting. Let's get back to a few more words that were used in 2019. Can you mention some, and will that change in 2020?
Yeah, so in a review of a year, I don't know if people are interested in words as much, but I thought it was interesting to talk about a few. But faster payments really came into vogue heavily in 2019, particularly in the corporate space, a little bit earlier for bankers. And it's not just making payments faster in some of these different regimes across different platforms, but it's brought about some new payment rails, completely different payment rail to settle items. And it's also, there's certainly some examples where they've just sped up the process. But I think what's been more important on the new words for faster payments, we haven't heard better payments as much. We've used that term. But when we talk to people and we do surveys, people care more about better, more comprehensive end-to-end view of payments rather than just speed. Speed is only one component. Clarity, visibility, enriched data, or the amount of data that comes across, so that it supports reconciliation, visibility, forecasting, transparency of costs. Those are far more important words. And we're going to talk about Swift GPI really briefly in a later section, but that'll be a tie into faster payments is really better payments. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and neural networks. AI and machine learning are a big topic, and people discuss that a lot. That's hot. People will come to webinars. They want to read up about it generally, but also specifically with Treasury. There are opportunities. Where are the opportunities? We see them in a number of places, and we have some really interesting podcasts on those. Hopefully we can put some of those in the notes where people can listen to the discussion about companies and technology firms that are really leveraging this technology as a fantastic tool that can do many more things than some other previous technology tools. So how do we improve forecasting? Well, machine learning can aid in that significantly. How can we detect anomalous activities? And that can be payment fraud or activity that could relate to fraud, or it could also detect problems in an operational process. And so the use of those tools is quite significant. And people are talking about learning about it. And there is application, and there are results that are occurring in Treasury. Neural networks, I don't know if I want to say too much about that. I think that's going to be more of a 2020 word. We hear it sometimes among the heavy technologists. I don't hear Treasury people talking about it too much. But we have a really interesting discussion about neural networks, this idea of how do we help the machines learn, and there's a subset of machine learning, or as part of machine learning, how do we teach them to not just think like humans, but gain that knowledge and experience. So neural networks is a 2020 term, I think. If not, maybe 2021, or I'll put it off in the future so I'm not wrong. And then the last word, one of the weird ones, like I used the other example before, is yeah, no. That's striking into people's conversations. Mm-hmm. You ask somebody a question, they go, yeah, no. And so that's like yes and no. And I'm not sure why that's slipping into people's lexicon, but it's like saying or.
Yeah. It almost sounds like yeah, no. If you say it really fast.
Yeah, no. I said yes, I said no. And that's just something that I noticed.
Yeah. Let's continue with another major topic. What happened with fraud and security?
Yeah, we solved all the problems with fraud and security. No, I think the talk about fraud and security has continued very strongly, and that is quite healthy. We talk about this a lot. There's a lot of webinars. We do surveys on it. We have podcast webinars across the board. We're talking about it a lot. So the situation is we've always said that crime does pay. It continues to pay. It's paying well. But why is that the case, and what's the situation now? They're very persistent. They're automated. They're leveraging technology extremely well, and they're adapting to the different defenses. And that's part of the reason why it continues to pay. So a couple things. I mean, there's an example of a fairly recent, this fall, an imposter fraud. Some people refer to it as business email compromise, where you're spoofing somebody else. There's a $37 million loss for Toyota Boshuku, one of the subsidiaries there. Very sophisticated. It's easy to sit back and say, well, that would never happen to us. We've got these controls. But it's happening to many, many organizations because the method of approach and the method of attack is increasingly sophisticated. So that is a key issue, that it is still significant. They're targeting all areas, and they're focusing increasingly on the payment channels as one area to focus on. A couple interesting things, and we have some podcasts on this too about what's going on. I find it very interesting that organizations are stealing data, or nation states are stealing data that's encrypted. It's not expected they can't unencrypt it now, but they're gathering that and harvesting it for the long term. And so this patient view of, we can get this, we'll eventually have the computing power to crack it. It won't take 1,000 years of a supercomputer. It'll take much less time. But if I steal that now, then I can connect the dots later with IDs, personal information, medical data, et cetera. So stealing data that's encrypted. So it means you can't just encrypt it, you still have to protect it. And they're doing that. That's a really long view, I think, of patience. The use of voice spoofing, where they're using artificial intelligence, they're using public recordings, using that to create messages. That just shows up not just on fake news on some of the social media sites, but they're using that for not business email compromise, but that spoofing. It might be a voice email compromise.
I think there was a story in the New York Times recently where someone called in and actually had the voice of the CEO trying to get information, get money.
That's exactly the type of example. So there's public recordings, and then using some of these tools, they can create different messages. And so you're hearing it, you're avoiding some of the processes that you use for control because the CEO has said this and you heard their voice. So that's interesting. The last interesting part on that was has to do with Swift CSP, the Swift Customer Security Program, which is designed to help people harden the endpoints before they get onto the Swift network, because that's where the weakness is. It's the endpoints. It's not the network. And whether it's Swift or whether it's the card programs, et cetera, how do you harden the networks? But what's interesting with Swift CSP is now it's no longer just self-attestation. The requirement now is you have to get a third party to review and do some of that attestation and testing. So I think that's very interesting at the maturity of the testing level and the expectations on some of these payment networks. We're going to see more of that. So it started with card. It's into Swift. We'll probably see it in some of the other payment networks at some point. I don't know when. I don't think that's necessarily 2020, but that will happen. But either way, the message is the sophistication is greater. We need to protect our payment channels, whether it's a requirement or not. Finally, we're in the process of closing out. We're just about done with the Treasury Fraud and Control Survey that's underwritten by Bottom Line Technologies. And as we're taking a peek at those results before it's completely in there, we're still well north of 300 already. It's not as pretty as you would like. It hasn't improved in the ways that we would like to have seen it. The prior year, without telling you what's going to happen there, but the prior year we saw increased spend. So in the beginning of this year, we saw people that spent more. They had an increased view of the sophistication of attacks. They thought the attack threat was increased, but they had confidence that they were better prepared. They had confidence they were better prepared, we think, because of they had put things in place, they used technology. But the losses and the issues at least matched prior years across different sectors. So they still had losses. There were still significant losses across the board. We don't see losses decreasing. We see the attack level increasing. And so we think that's a little bit too confident given the threat that's coming in. And the machine-human response, I don't think has been as balanced as it should be. So we've seen increased confidence, a greater shoring up on the technology front. Not to say that there couldn't be more done there, but on the human side, that is definitely trailing. More so on the corporate side than on the banking side. Banks are much better at preparing their people and keeping their people updated and upgraded, if you will, compared to corporations. So the the human elements, the effective training on a consistent, ongoing basis is lagging.
So are you saying that companies feel like they have some sense of security, but it's not enough?
Yes, they're feeling more confident than they should given the results on the field.
So before we talk about technology in 2019, can we cover Strategic Treasure's content delivery channels? What have you seen?
Well, I gave a little bit of hint about that before with the survey and what's going on, but I think what we're seeing, and GDPR, I mean, the issue is deep content seems to win. And this is what we see. We put out a lot of information different ways, and I'm not trying to make this a commercial, but the more content you put out that's deep as opposed to, clickbait, there's, getting clicks is different from you provide good content in different areas. And we see that. So that's one aspect that's a theme across the board. So banks know that, technology firms know that, corporations know that. People want good content with whatever they're doing. They don't want fluff. If they're going to spend time on it, it has to be deep and noteworthy. And that's effective for whether you're in a meeting with someone or whether you're trying to market to a particular area or share information and gain mind share. The second topic is that we're seeing that audio is beating out video. I know that's been the case in other industries. That's certainly been the case with us. We've had a YouTube channel for quite some time. We put out videos, and it's done fantastic, and it continues to grow at good rates. YouTube and the video is showing, solid growth. The audio is increasing rapidly, way faster than we saw in the other version. So, people from over 110 countries.
So you're in 110 countries now.
Yeah, well, so are you, because you're hosting this podcast. So it's funny that it happens that way. And I think we've added to the weekly cadence of a Saturday release of the podcast. We've added a shorter series that it's podcast is a long form discussion, deep content. We've also added something that's a little shorter. So instead of 20 or 25 minutes or 30 minutes, we have a coffee break series, which is,
The coffee break sessions?
Coffee break sessions, yeah. The coffee break sessions are 5 to 10 minutes or so, focused on one topic, foundational, interesting, short, and more voices from our firm are being heard. And there's external interviews as well. And so it's, we're sharing that with some different hosts on that. And the focus is tight, and that's going very well too.
Do you think that the audio is more popular as opposed to watching a video just because people are busy, right? I mean, people are on the go, they're working, they've got families, and they need information pretty quickly at their convenience.
I think that's right, and they do it when they're doing something. They can do the audio when you're doing something else. You can drive, work out, walk. Video is if you're at the office, you're looking at it, and you'll do something very short, but it's not as frequently you're going to sit down and learn. So it provides that opportunity to focus on a topic, which is important. I mean, that concept I said at the beginning, deep content wins. People need to focus. And so audio is usually done when you're doing something that you have to do, but you could only focus on, one input like audio. And I think that's working out well.
What are the big stories on technology this past year?
We spent a lot of time on our podcast talking about that and writing about. So I'll try to be really brief. The big stories, payments, better payments, as we talked about some of the words before. Big story, I think, too, is to support that idea that better payments is more important than just speed. Speed is only one factor. An example of Swift GPI. We did a very interesting discussion with the adoption and what's going on with Swift GPI. But that is a microcosm of what people are looking for. Hey, I need visibility, speed, transparency across the board, across borders too. Right. That it is really making a big impact, and that's proving that out. I want better, not just faster. Faster is only one element. Second is BI and self-service, and we talked about that in terms of the definitions or words that are being used. But this idea of self-service and doing analysis is a massive opportunity in technology because the tools are better and people are more familiar with it. I mean, BI has been around, in-memory computing with BI tools has been around for really probably about 8 years or so when some of that first came out. You can load everything in memory. You can instantly flip it around. That's been around for a while, but finance didn't know about it. Treasury didn't know about it and didn't understand the implications. Well, now everyone's prepared mentally for it. They're seeing it, And now they're starting to think of how I can use that. So it's been around for a while, but the mind is ready for that. So that self-service, the end person can make those, ask the question, get the answer, as opposed to ask a question, go to someone, wait 4 days or a week, to hear them say why they can't get at the core data and then come back and then eventually do it. The turnaround is faster, and that's putting it in the hands of the end users. Great. We talked about APIs briefly. That is really a big element of making connections and the ecosystem and treasury more useful. I can connect to more banks with some simpler connections. And robotic process automation is absolutely a big trend. We're seeing more companies learning about that, putting in pilot programs and biting off certain projects to help reduce some of the handoffs between systems. Finally, we also talked about machine learning, AI. That's really, companies are putting these out in betas. Technology firms are putting these out in betas. Companies are experimenting with it. Very, very powerful tool, and this is going to be exciting as we go forward. So this is, if you look at if it was 1 year, it might be 2021 where AI is the big player. But it certainly has started now. So as we think about things in 4 or 5 years, we're really seeing the adoption of this and the awareness of it starting now. We should see this peak over in the next 3, 4, 5 years, where everyone's doing it and it's no longer a hot topic. We're using this throughout our processes.
Right. Any final thoughts?
No, I think this was fun. A lot of different discussions, and we really didn't talk too much about 2020. Maybe we'll have to do another podcast on that. But there's a couple of these things that everything doesn't fit discretely in a year. But there's a lot of interesting, exciting things, very, very positive, maybe not as optimistic as before in terms of global economics, but for Treasury, it's a really, really good time. There's so much going on, technology, structure, how we're thinking about things, that this is going to be a good multi-year run for Treasury to do interesting, very useful things for their organizations.
Well, I wish you much success in the coming year.
You too, Meredith.
Thanks.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.